Hey, everybody, and welcome to Ideas On. This month is October, and we're sort of celebrating the wonderful world of villains. So, our villainous bloggers are on here today: Jared Wells, and Olivia Allen, and Duncan Kennedy. And I'm Bob Allen, and we're going to talk about villains. Olivia, tell us where you went here.
Okay, so you may or may not have read my blog, but in my classes I'm a college student. In my classes and in my personal life and my life as a writer, I study a lot of mythology and folklore and religion. The definitions get kind of finicky when it comes to those words, so I'm gonna say them all, but I think there's overlap. I find it fascinating and I really love the stories. Um, and so that was the angle, that was one of the angles I took with the blog I wrote. And also, I think, especially, not necessarily especially nowadays, but in America right now, we are seeing it a lot if we are paying attention. And tensions are high this month. So there's the thing where narratives can be created to vilify groups of people, to trying to not be too political, but I think we get the idea. um, False narratives vilifying marginalized groups of people becomes a real problem. Anyway, I am a woman, so I wanted to go at it from that angle, because I can speak to that. And so the study of women in mythology and folklore is really interesting. And sometimes it's like, clearly this has it shows up in stories of the creation of womankind sometimes, where women clearly are established as the evil ones. The Pandora story, I suppose you could see it in the Eve story in the Bible, but I am not an expert on the Bible, so I'm not going to claim to have a lot of knowledge on that. But Hesiod's Pandora story is a time. Um, and then sometimes there's figures. A lot of the times they represent things that are feared, by people in my culture at least. But I think death is something of a universal fear for humans because it's a mystery. I mean, I can't speak for all humans, but it's a thing. Um, and so a lot of death goddesses or death entities, like banshees or other spectral beings, turn into monsters and villains. And in modern folklore or in old stories, not in modern folklore, like modern fiction, comic books, video games, I think it's sad because these are great characters and fascinating and complex, and you lose the nuance. And it's interesting to explore why that happens, and it makes me mad because I really like these mythological figures. And on a deeper level, it's important to understand that oftentimes people who are painted as villains might not be.
Great, great. Jared, where'd you go?
Well, I also sort of was trying to wrap my mind around the definition of a villain. And of course, in storytelling, there's no more fundamental conflict than that of good and evil. And generally, the hero falls on the good, the villain represents the evil. But obviously, life doesn't work like that. There's not such binary terms that can qualify real human beings. And so when you get into fiction, particularly when it comes to very simple stories, especially like superheroes. Not so much nowadays, but sort of how you think of when Batman and Superman and all of that were at their beginnings. They were very clearly defined villains. These are clearly the bad guys. I mean, there still are today, but discussing what qualities about villains make them truly villainous. I think when you boil it down to the essential qualities, there isn't too much of a difference between a hero and a villain. It truly is a matter of perspective, as is very evident, I think, in life in many ways, in politics. It's a matter of where you see the good and where you see the evil. And I think villains become very interesting foils for people to compare themselves to, because, you know, if you're a hero, you're essentially hopefully doing the right things for the right reasons. If you're doing the wrong things for the right reasons, I guess you would be called an anti-hero, which personally I tend to like more than villains. But struggling with those terminologies as a writer is something that it always causes me to re-examine how I think about building characters. And I think that around Halloween time, it's great to take a look at your favorite villains and see how you can find new character traits and ways to paint morality in not such a black and white way.
Cool. Duncan, where'd you come from?
I came at it from more of a standpoint of due diligence in terms of character development. You know, just because somebody does bad things doesn't necessarily mean that they are a villain. They may qualify them as a bad guy, as Jared mentioned, but you know, looking at you know, the James Bond movies, for instance, there was a long string of them where there was a different bad guy in every James Bond movie, especially in the 80s. And we never had enough time to really get to know them, nor really care about their master plan to destroy the world. They were just this foil for evil, but they weren't really a true villain, or didn't get to that upper strata of us understanding enough of their character, whether it's depravity or a twisted, warped view of the world or whatever it was, that was their motivation for them to be that bad. And many times it's not so much that they want to be the worst person in the world or they want to do the worst things in the world. It's that they have a twisted view of what the world has done to them, or a twisted sense of unfairness for what has happened to them in their life, that they are now expressing this anger, this violence to other people. And so to me, you know, the true villain in the blog that I wrote was time, and that many times and in many you know, entertainment forms, the villain is never given the time to truly develop as a character, so that we can appreciate where they are coming from and why they are doing the things that they are doing. And when we get that, it's often that the villain isn't really that much different from us, or we might not have done, or we may have chosen a similar reaction to what was the crucible moment that they switched from good to evil, or whatever it may have been that flipped the switch that started this antisocial behavior, or whatever they may be doing. And so in many ways, a lot of the bad guys and villains that we see in entertainment, whether it's movies, TVs, I know it's a time compressed format, so we don't have that luxury like we do in books and other long formats, where you can really get into that depth of character development. But many times it's just they're disposable bad guys. And so we're really just watching them being in charge of the bad guys, or being the head guy of the bad guys, but we're not really getting a chance to appreciate them being a villain with a motivation that suddenly gets to the awkward side of ourselves, which is, wow, I you know, in another life, I could see myself being that angry, or being that frustrated, or being, you know, that twisted or warped. And as closer as it gets to something I might consider, then that's the true discomfort. And now that's the real relationship that we have with the villain, capital V, is that we're starting to see some of ourselves in their background, in their backstory, in the decisions that they make. And we feel uncomfortable with that, not because of what we see, the destruction that they're doing on the screen, but because we're getting uncomfortable with how closely we're able to start to relate to this person. And in that, there's that wonderful machination of, ooh, you know, so at least for me, that's where I was going.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess I can bet cleanup. I mean, it's fascinating to me too that we all kind of came at this from one similar point of view, which is, yeah, villain, not as easy as you think, you know, not as simple as you think. Maybe so I chose to write about about Caliban, who is the miscreant critter who lives on the island of Prospero in Shakespeare's Tempest. He's always fascinated me as a character anyway, even in the way Shakespeare wrote him, because right from the get-go, he's described as, vile and an animal, and art thou a fish or art thou a man? But Shakespeare very carefully wrote scenes where we're very, very touched by him. It's like, hey, how come you're treating him so bad? He's got feelings too. So the whole idea is I guess to me, I'd say one more thing. I always find, no matter what the story is, even sometimes when it's hard to look at them, the villains to me are always the most fascinating characters. They just tend to be a little bit less one dimensional, frankly, than the heroes. So Caliban is that for sure. And over the arc of the story, we don't learn too much about him, but one interesting sort of literary critical point of view on this that I really read up on was, and it really came to in a story I heard on the radio about what's called the Robben Island Shakespeare. So very briefly, when Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island, there was a book of Shakespeare's plays, and they passed it around, and people read it, and it became a metaphor. Many of the plays, particularly The Tempest, became a metaphor for what they were going through as prisoners. So one of the ways Caliban is represented, and the way critics now look at it, is he is a metaphor for people who have been colonized. If you think about it, Caliban was the indigenous people of that island. Mm-hmm. Prospero and Miranda were not. They were dropped off there. They came from Europe to this island, and he was immediately subjugated, right? So there's a whole other piece of metaphor here. So sometimes a villain's not always a villain, I guess is where I went. So it's just fascinating to me about the notion that, and we always talk about it, you can't have a great story without conflict, and you really can't have a conflict unless you have some back and forth amongst the characters. But to me, this notion in all forms, you pick literature, pick games, pick films, pick books, who gets vilified and when are they vilified? And I think something Olivia brought up, and Duncan, you brought it up too, is, and I'd love to hear you guys riff on this a little, fascinates me is that notion that, the reason villains bug us a little is that's our shadow too. It's the part of us we don't want to look at very much, because you can go, I have met the enemy and he is me. So I don't know, you guys can go there if you want, but that kind of always tickles me to think about.
Doesn't Caliban speak in verse too, like the Royal Shakespeare characters?
He does. Yeah, he does speak in verse. And he muses a lot. He muses about, I showed you the island. I taught you all of its secrets. I showed you where water was. I showed you where the sweet berries were. And then you locked me in a tree, or you imprisoned me in a rock. I can't remember what he did, but
Ariel was the one who was imprisoned in a tree.
Yeah, that's right. So he said, "Well, why did you do that?" So yeah,
they were imprisoned in a tree, and Prospero saved them, which is why they are indebted to Prospero.
Right.
It's interesting to me that at the end of the Tempest, Prospero frees Ariel, and they're allowed to go, and there's not a word to Caliban, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, in fact, we don't know what happens to him.
I'm assuming he got his island back, but we may never.
They leave. So
one thing that I'd add on to your lens is also the why. Why is this villain exist? If it's a morality play, then you're really just you're demonstrating appropriate behavior for the audience, and so you really want that shallow bad guy just because you're saying, don't behave this way. But if it's more of an exploration into the human psyche, or the complexity of relationships, then the delineation really gets grayed out, and that creates that wonderful space of discomfort, as you were saying, where we have met the enemy and the enemy is me. So I think a good part of it is, why are we communicating this story? And within that, there are some boundaries of why the villain exists and how rich that character can be.
The interesting part about the Tempest is that, Prospero is kind of villainous too in his own way.
Absolutely, he does not behave well a lot of the time. He's a very manipulative guy.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Song of the South. I know it's culturally insensitive and it's out of place, out of time, but if you really watch the movie, the bad guys are the parents. The bad guys are
Yeah.
the landed aristocracy.
Exactly
And
right.
it's a very interesting twist on what you think you're going to see and what you think the story is going to be. And by the end of it, you're right there with the kids.
Well, and so to add to the complexity theory a little bit, if you think about current day villains, so Vader or Thanos, I mean, they got where they were because some bad stuff happened to them. So
Mhm.
it's there's a kind of a karmic thing of, okay, yeah, I'm a bad guy, but let's not forget I went through some very hard stuff and I had to process it somehow. So I am the way I am for a reason, right?
So Thanos is interesting, because like so did Gamora, and anyway, but she didn't kill half the universe. But Thanos is a fool because he gets the ability to create or destroy anything, and he thinks, you know what? I can save everything by destroying half of the universe or whatever it was, instead of just, you know what, I can make more resources because I have unlimited power now. Like, if you're gonna be a god, be a benevolent one.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, but look, real life corollaries. It occurred to me when you guys were talking a minute ago. I wonder because there are villainous characters in real life too, right? And who they are
Yeah.
from your point of view. It depends on your lens. One person's villain is another person's hero, particularly. And we've been dancing all around politics, but since it's so prevalent right now, it's an easy place to see that. I rode my bike today, and you can ride through a neighborhood and tell who thinks who's a villain. So I just wonder if you if you look at the fables that will come out of our era 100 years hence. I wonder how all of this will play out in terms of the way new villains are created. How does that go forward?
Ask Christopher Columbus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great example. Great example, Duncan. Who was when I was a kid, which was granted in the Stone Age, but you know, we got a day off of school, and what he's studying in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he came and
Yeah.
discovered America. Yay! Well, he didn't. He came over and made everybody sick, and then opened the door to Europeans coming subjugating an entire people who already lived here. Which, by the way, we still don't talk about today in this country. We don't talk about the great American genocide in this country. He was a bad guy. He really was a bad guy.
Sure.
You know,
And well, in that note, it's interesting because, of course, they always say that the victors always write the history books, and when you're looking at a subject like Columbus, in my blog, I specifically called out George Washington, actually, because he is back at that time, and in American history, he is canonized as a deific figure. Somebody who was right and just in every way. Clearly, he had a lot of things that, by today's standards, by any standards, are not to be celebrated and are not to be recognized. But in his context in the time, thinking about how the British spoke about him during the American Revolution. He was a traitor, he was a backstabber, he was a murderer, he was getting rid of a government that they made themselves out to be one that was one to be respected and one that should stay around. But to this day, I don't know that British people still hold a grudge against George Washington. I don't. Perhaps they do silently, but I don't know if it's there. But it going back to the notion of time, I wonder if, in a sense, time can also erase villainy in some cases when the perceived good outweighs what in only contextually was considered evil.
Yeah. George Washington is not standing next to Oliver Cromwell.
I didn't think of that.
Yeah. Well, the other one too is and I think we all touched on this in one way or another. But Olivia's notes about some of these classic mythological villains. No great villain is all villain.
Not villains.
Well, they're not. They are, but they aren't always. So sometimes they're villainous, and sometimes they're not villainous. And
I guess it also kind of depends on which side of the battle you're on.
Yeah.
Or moment in time, you've got benevolent gods doing terrible things to innocent people one night, and the next night they're saving the world.
Yep.
If I'm gonna bring up Zeus, if there's any villainous mythological character, it's gonna be Zeus, man. Or Kronos. You know what? The Kronos ate his kids. Zeus. We're not gonna get started on Zeus because I could go off, but like the men in the Greek pantheon, I will say, problematic.
Well,
there are things no one knows about Hera, about how she was abused, and now she's just painted as this jealous wife. Like, it's not great. But also, it's interesting how real world again, we don't just have historical figures that are larger than life deified characters. We have historical figures that are larger than life vilified characters, like Hitler and Henry VIII. I don't know if Henry VIII actually is vilified, but he's vilified by me because he was terrible. Henry VIII is the worst. I've been watching a lot of historical dramas with my roommate. But anyway, he's a bad man.
Well, here's what I think everybody agrees, and I bet you most people do. You know, the truth is we love our villains. I mean, we readers of engagers in stories, we really love our villains. As I think I mentioned this in the blog, but you know, imagine Star Wars without Vader. It's not possible. It's not possible. You know, you just
Star Wars without Vader is Kylo Ren.
so we love them, and they add a lot of the spice, obviously, and a lot of the juice to the tales we tell. You know, dialing them up and down is probably the fun part. As kind of a wrap up, I remember the story about, you know, when we were several years ago, we were all working on kind of a rethink of the Carmen Sandiego story. You know, one of my favorite characters. You know, and she's had a lot of lives as a game and as a television series. And so one of the things was we updated her character and we turned her into that classic Captain Nemo villain with a heart of gold who, yeah, she goes around and does very bad things. She's a thief and a robber but if you really look at her new backstory, the way we wrote it, she did them for a good reason. She was an environmental activist, and she was, you know, she was a social justice activist, and a lot of the bad things she did through her henchmen turned out to be for a very good reason for some other people. So, you know, that's really the fun of it.
I mean, who's she stealing from, though?
Sorry?
Who's she stealing from?
The way we wrote it, mostly guys it's pretty fun to steal from. Big corporation.
Oh, okay, then we're good. She's not a villain.
Yeah, we've lost the notion of time and history. Henry VIII may have been a very bad guy, but in doing what he did in establishing the Church of England, separating it from the Roman Catholic Church, he bred the underpinnings of British, or excuse me, at that time, English exceptionalism. And in that gave us the bedrock for American exceptionalism and the drive in the 20th century. Now you can also go full around and say, where's American exceptionalism gotten us to this point, you know, with not having a good worldview or collaborative view with the world.
He established the Church of England so he could get a divorce, and then later he killed his 19-year-old wife.
I'm not saying he wasn't a bad guy. I'm saying, but bad guys can have good impact, you know. And again, there's that, you know, the conflict.
Maybe that's transformative, right? Maybe it's not the bad guy who has the good impact. It's people take what the bad guy did, grab the pieces that might be beneficial, and say, well, let's build on those. I mean,
sure.
To your other point, any quote good idea overworked quickly becomes a pretty rancid idea. To your point about, in my view, the extraordinarily jingoistic level people have taken the notion of American exceptionalism to is not healthy. It's not good for anybody. Hey, we need to wrap it up. So, Olivia, you are the curator. Remind us, what is next month's topic?
Next month, we have improvisation, which means this discussion will have no plans at all, and we will talk only about fish.
Unlike this week, when it had no plans at all. So we appreciate everybody being with us. We hope you'll look at the blogs at Ideas On. You can also catch us on our podcast. Same stuff here. Just don't have to look at our gorgeous faces. So we'll see you next month. Thanks.
Bye.